When a family decided to adopt a rescue cat, they never could have anticipated how it would interact with their newborn child. When the mother spied on the pair through a secret camera, she was shocked to see what was happening in the nursery every night. Mr. and Mrs. Tate were animal lovers expecting their first child. They had 2 beautiful dogs and had just unfortunately lost their beloved cat to old age. They were known in their community for their love of animals. They had adopted both dogs from a local rescue center where they often volunteered. So, when the rescue center found out that they would receive a beautiful Siamese cat that needed lots of love, they thought about the Tates immediately. The Tates' previous cat had also just happened to be Siamese, which meant they were quite familiar with the breed. The rescue center had found the kitten in a terrible state. They named her Sapphire for her beautiful, vibrant eyes. Against her skinny body, they stood about a mile away. She had been found in an alley in the city in horrible condition. When a good Samaritan found her on their way to get some coffee, they had immediately seen that she was in pain. However, they didn't quite know the extent of pain she was in. It was only when Sapphire got to the rescue center and received some medical attention that they found out how bad her situation really was. The poor cat had broken ribs and a pelvis. How she managed to even move around, they didn't know. Their theory was that she'd been struck by a moving vehicle whilst crossing the street and had been left to fend for herself for several days in a back alley. So, straight away, Sapphire went into surgery to get her injuries fixed. Luckily, it all went very successfully. She was patched up and casted to protect the movement of her bones whilst they were healing. Fixing the physical aspect of an animal is easy enough. It's the emotional side that really takes work. Of course, all the staff and volunteers did their utmost to make Sapphire feel loved and cared for. Still, they all knew that she needed a permanent home in order to truly feel safe. And that's where the Tates came in. Now, at first, Mrs. Tate was a bit apprehensive because she was so far along in her pregnancy. The idea of having a cat that needed extra help seemed like a bit of a challenge. Pregnant women are also exposed to the risk of toxoplasmosis, which is a dangerous issue for their unborn child that can be contracted through physical contact with a cat's excrement. However, her husband encouraged it and promised her that he would be the only one to clean Sapphire's litter tray. Both he and Mrs. Tate were simply in love with the beautiful Siamese they saw in a cage at the shelter. She needed to come home with them. Ultimately, the fact that Mrs. Tate was so pregnant helped Sapphire. She had taken a step back from work to get her home ready for her little one, but there was only so much to do. With her husband at work all day, she often grew quite lonely. But thanks to Sapphire, she had someone to fuss over every day and take care of. Sapphire was in her element. She loved her new home and could feel all the love around her. Her favorite part of the house was definitely Mrs. Tate's stomach. From the first moment, she would cuddle right up to her new owner's pregnant bump. It was as if she could tell the baby inside would soon be her friend, or perhaps so she hoped. At night, it even became a game. All Sapphire wanted to do was cuddle Mrs. Tate's tummy. But sometimes it just proved cumbersome for the pregnant lady, so Mr. Tate would step in and cuddle Sapphire on his chest until she fell asleep. He knew that she herself was just a baby and wanted love. This continued for the rest of Mrs. Tate's pregnancy. Sapphire healed well with time, and very soon was running around the house with all the freedom her now healthy body could offer her. At night, she made it a habit of sleeping on the pillow above Mr. Tate's head. It was a ritual the two of them were quite used to, and it worked out well. When the time came for Mrs. Tate to have her baby, she was gone from home for just 2 days. When she returned, Sapphire was overjoyed. But her demeanor changed radically as soon as she saw the baby. It was somewhat hilarious to witness. Sapphire was immediately apprehensive of the newborn. She would skulk around from a distance, trying to suss out the object that was taking all the attention away from her. To make it worse, when the baby cried, Sapphire couldn't help but hide in the room's opposite corner. She was clearly not too fond of its screams. The Tates witnessed all of this, but they weren't too concerned due to their experience with animals. Well, that is, until Sapphire stopped sleeping on Mr. Tate's pillow in their room. When her behavior shifted like that, they began to worry a little. At first, they put it down to her probably sleeping in the lounge or near the window to watch the activity outside. But one night, that changed. It just so happened that Mrs. Tate couldn't sleep after nursing her baby in the middle of the night. She was tossing and turning the whole night, so much so that she eventually got up. She was irritable and she needed to eat something. She thought she would just pop into the nursery, check in with her baby, and then grab a snack. That's when something disturbing happened. She entered the baby's nursery as quietly as she could so as not to wake the child. And that's when she saw the shadow of a body looming over her child. Before she could react, it jumped down and zoomed out of the room. She quickly followed and caught a glimpse of Sapphire turning the corner off her corridor. Mrs. Tate couldn't help but feel unnerved. Something about the scene that she'd walked in on didn't quite comfort her, especially considering the behavior of Sapphire that she'd seen around the baby so far. She checked on her child and then quietly closed the door. When she got back in bed, she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. She wondered if Sapphire had been haunting her baby all the nights that she hadn't been sleeping with them. The child didn't look physically hurt though, and it was still sleeping soundly, but she needed to know what was happening anyway. So, right then and there, she decided that she would install a camera to film what the cat was up to. The next day, Mrs. Tate told her husband what she had witnessed, so they set off to the store to get a camera. They installed it that very day and waited anxiously to see what it would catch that night. The two of them were anxious to see what was going on. They hoped it wasn't anything sinister, but what were they to do but wait? The next day, they loaded the footage onto their computer and pressed play. Now, at first there wasn't much, so Mr. Tate had to skip a bit. That is, until they saw Sapphire's lean body slink into the nursery. Mrs. Tate couldn't help but shriek in fear, but her husband placed a comforting hand over her shoulder and convinced her to keep watching. They held their breath as the cat climbed up into the baby's crib. Sapphire stood over it for a while, and then began to circle the child. Mrs. Tate could feel her heart beating in her throat as she watched. Then, Sapphire did something that neither Tate could have anticipated. She laid down behind the baby and cast one of her arms over its sleeping body in a warm embrace. Sapphire was cuddling the child while it slept, just as she had done while the baby was in the womb. It was such a heartwarming sight to see. Clearly, all this time, Sapphire had liked the child and wanted to protect it while its parents slept. All those nights when they had wondered where their beloved cat was, she'd been looking after their newest addition to the family. The Tates simply laughed with joy at what they saw before them and sighed in relief. They knew that everything was going to be okay after all. What an incredibly heartwarming story. What would you think if your cat acted suspiciously around your child? Have you ever experienced something similar with a pet and a newborn? Let us know in the comments below.